if there was one other like section I want to try to talk about, it really is the poles. Because as a Hollow Earth guy, I do love talking about the polar areas, and you've done some videos on articles you found recently about polar exploration that are interesting. One article I thought was great was titled "On Wheels to the South Pole: An American Expedition Will Cross the Antarctic Sea in a Sailboat on Wheels," where they expect to find a warm, open, blooming country.
Yep.
Belgium and Norway are rapidly fitting boats to race with Uncle Sam to the spot. Nansen, Perry, and Andre eclipsed by Halprin and Cope. Talk to us about this, because I know about Nansen and Perry, but I don't think I've even heard of Halprin and Cope.
Yeah. So I've mentioned Admiral Byrd before in his stories, and that there was nothing willy-nilly about it at all. And again, going back to the correlating things with radium, this all ties in with radium, World War One. You know, there are plenty of books out there and information about how the Nazis have basically abandoned the war front and put all of their materials and resources into developing their submarines, and that they basically bankrupted their war budget or whatever to build these submarines, and that they had the first nuclear submarines in existence, and that they were coming into the Gulf of Mexico, and that, of course, where did they go? Well, New Schwabenland, they had been exploring underneath the ice of Antarctica. This was kind of publicly spoken of in Germany. And yeah, authors had written that beyond 80 degrees northern and southern latitudes, that everything actually goes away from ice and becomes fair and warm. And it's just that barrier to get through into the 80s, 82s and on, right? And I know you're familiar with, what's that book? The Smoky God. Well, the there were many Soviet authors who wrote about that same thing, that there were unexplainable migrations of animals north. Oh, winter's coming and these animals go north,
Yeah.
right? An author wrote a book about it, and he describes dinosaurs and all kinds of crazy stuff. And even on the cover of the book, again, it's in Russian. I can't tell you exactly what it says, but it's basically this scientist exploring the idea that there is a tropical or warm area at the poles, or beyond what we call the poles. And in that same umbrella, authors in the late 1700s and early 1800s were saying that the lost tribes actually went beyond the poles, and that they suspected if they got to the northern latitudes and southern latitudes, the lost tribes weren't lost. They were actually just in these tropical regions. And in another video that I did called Beyond the Ice Wall, many authors said they were well aware of people, multiple people, not multiple groups of people beyond the southern pole or ice wall. They call it an ice wall. That beyond the ice wall was another civilization of dark-skinned people in tropical climates. But yeah, that exploration that you mentioned, they basically were trying to figure out how they could venture as far inland as they could, because they were using so many resources with dogs and trying to travel with archaic versions of vehicles, and they failed miserably. So they found areas that were completely flat, and they developed that idea that you had mentioned, this sailboat, so to say, where they could sail on this kind of icy plateau and go further inland than anyone had ever gone. And then this obviously spirals into World War One and the Nazis building a secret base there, and why they invested all of their resources and abandoned the front and basically let the Allied powers win, was essentially because they had just abandoned ship anyway, and that the beyond the ice wall or the Antarctic region in general was where they made their new base.
I love the idea of it, and it is just crazy how in an unconnected world these people are going out in crafts that seem not necessarily equipped for the investigation or expedition they want to take, and they're just like, it's fine, a sailboat on wheels, maybe we'll hit land and we'll use the wheels, maybe we'll just figure it out, we'll see what happens. I mean, that is a different kind of mind today. I mean, kids aren't even fucking anymore because they can't have a face-to-face interaction with a female.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just things have
The
definitely
age of
changed.
exploration it's still alive, but whatever they're exploring and finding, we're not able to have privy to. But yeah, there was a gentleman who explored the North Pole by blimp. He built this crazy house. It was like an apartment. It was encased, and it's super thick walls. And guess what? He gets above 80 to 82 degrees, and then they don't tell you what he saw.
Mm. Very crazy. And
They explain like his logbooks and the things he's experiencing as he's going from like 65 to 70, 75 to 80, and then they don't even tell you what he saw at the poles. So it's like that's kind of the generalization there, is that even then people were quite frankly saying that we're aware that there are civilizations beyond these areas. And they, again, the biblical references, it's why is that? These lost tribes, they went underground or they went to the poles or beyond the ice wall. It's very interesting. We talk about, I'm sure you've seen the map of the lands beyond the wall. And, it was at the UN, supposedly. Obviously, I didn't see it myself, but that map made the rounds there, 10 years ago or so. The flat earth map that I'm sure you've seen.
Yeah. And that's what I wanted to ask you about, is kind of how you picture these things, because I've always been a hollow earth person. So it's not hard to imagine that you go past the ice and you get to a hole and there's warmth there.
Yeah.
But outside of that, it seems a little hard to wrestle with conceptually to get a good picture of it, unless you are just a flat earth person. I mean, you mentioned this being a container. Well, you can even have a very conventional cosmology and picture of everything and still agree with that, because you could just say, well, the Van Allen radiation belt, we can't get through that. It would cook any person. So that is essentially a container. And then, of course, people use words like firmament that insinuates that a person is a flat earther. Ice wall doesn't insinuate anything, because look at any picture of Antarctica. Look at any picture of it. It is an ice wall. So especially if you go back 100 years, 200 years, that's how they're going to describe it.
Yep. But and they're navigating 70,000 miles of ice wall.
Right. So I want to know kind of what you think, like, how do we get to warmth and civilization beyond the ice wall? Do you think of it as a hollow earth kind of cavity, or do you think of it more in a flat earth kind of paradigm? Like, how does it work out in your mind that there are warm areas beyond the poles?
Yeah, until I like physically explore all these things to say for certain, I don't know. And I don't think anyone really knows. And if they do, they're not privy to share with the public. But I lean more towards a flat realm. The most sacred symbol being the monad, I think, is a direct relation to the realm we inhabit. Thinking of it kind of like an accretion disk, the flat plane of a toroid. When you talk about vacuum and space and firmament or some kind of barrier exists, whether it's the Van Allen radiation belt or an actual steadfast barrier, as biblical references often make, and many other cultures actually make the firmament references in their sacred texts. But where the firmament ends, that's the question, right? Where it stops. Like, where would you hit it if you were walking? If I just started walking east and went for the rest of my life, would I eventually hit some kind of ice wall or, firmament? I don't know. But there's so many people in this time frame, again, going off just what I'm presenting to people in your audience. There's so many people in this time frame who are very interested in the poles, who quite openly think that there is a land that is not only inhabitable, but inhabited, and that the weather, I mean, they find coal when they first, got further inland, once they had the technology to venture and could survive further inland in Antarctica, they were finding coal, and they were finding tropical foliage in the coal. I have a video called The Origins of Coal, and they show that it's just the breakdown of organic matter, primarily trees. And that in some of these coal formations, you can find perfect representations of leaves. And, the deeper you go in certain places, the foliage gets gigantic. I mean, absolutely monstrous and tropical in nature and origin. And they find these same types of things in Antarctica. So Antarctica at one point was tropical, just like I said about Alaska, and that through some event that I think is fairly recent in our history, judging by what you could find in Alaska, going down just a few feet below the surface and looking at the animal record there and foliage, that this kind of Noah's flood vapor canopy fell relatively recently and created the weather or cosmology that we know of with the sun and the moon and the stars and the four seasons. That's all fairly new.
Mm-hmm.
And even the evidence they find below ground supports that theory in Antarctica. And I think that if that's the case, whether or not there's an actual ice wall or the ice wall is a new formation, I can't say for sure, but it seems likely that there is a life. What kind of life and to what degree beyond this, I have no idea. But it seems they're showing you that there was life relatively close in the time frame. Although they use these crazy 100,000 million years when they talk about cultural layers.
Right.
Well, that one article I talked about in Mexico, where the gentleman found 4 buried cities, how that you can't date that, but they're finding Chinese artifacts and block Hebrew and these kind of inscriptions at the 4th base layer that would say it's relatively close to our time frame. But again, as you know, and you've had so many guests, these ideas of time and millions and billions of years, I think, is preposterous. And that many of these things we spoke of today are quite closer to our time frame. But yeah, long-winded answer. But what's beyond? I'm sure there's something. To what degree, I have no idea.
Yeah.
But it seemed in this time frame that I present on my channel, many people were like, there is something there, and there are people they were fairly certain of.
Yeah. Well, I can't expect you to have the answers to everything, but I do think we're breaking new ground, no pun intended, about various things that, even though I've had many guests, they have not talked about some of these things. They have not talked about the pyramids as vaults. So I find it all very provocative, and I could do this all day. Can you believe it, people? A video clip and a peek into how that sweet THC sausage is made. For some people, I'm sure it's nice to put a face to the name, so I started making clips that are a little more YouTube friendly than the full show tends to be. Get the full show on any podcasting platform. I prefer to keep it audio only, so we have a more decentralized distribution for a controversial show, and also so I can edit out the ums and ahs and barking dogs and all the things that happen when a person records in their home environment. And then if you really like the show, you can sign up for THC Plus, and instead of 1-hour interviews, you get the full 2-hour interview for just $8. I think that's a better deal, more of a win-win than asking you to support the show by booking a therapy session or buying generic Viagra. It's getting weird out there, folks. So just go to the highersidechats.com or click the link at the top of any set of show notes, and all your wildest dreams will come true. All right? All right.